U.S. history students, this is another installment of Baker's Corner or Baker's Backyard. I hope you're doing great. We're going to look at our second lesson on the first industrial revolution. And so we're going to dive into this pretty quick. For those of you that did the assignments on the application of internal improvements, et cetera, we'll kind of build upon that a little bit with the debates and divisions between, the different economies that are developing and also the different ways of approaching it. But before then, we want to look at our objectives for continuing and then also, of course, today. So we want to be able to define internal improvements a little bit more as we look at the importance of things like how do we get goods from place to place through roads, canals, etc. Okay, we want to be able to define market revolution, a specific key term, and both identify, describe, and explain the importance of things like manufacturing, free enterprise concepts, and also banking with its development. Okay, so a definition and also application. And then thirdly, identify how the development of both American manufacturing and agriculture during the first industrial revolution impacted relations between the North and the South, because this is going to be an ongoing thing that we continue to see as we move closer to the American Civil War, and of course, even to an extent afterwards. So let's get started. So what is a market revolution, you might ask? What's happening? Well, a revolution involves change. Things that could be dramatic, small scale, okay? Things that kind of happen over time that eventually kind of leads to larger scale things, but it's a shift. Now, guys, think about what comes to mind when you think of the word shift. It's movement, okay? So in other words, something is going into a different form than what it previously was, from a home-based agricultural economy. So in other words, more people before this revolution, what are they doing? They're farming subsistence things. In other words, for themselves, their local communities perhaps. Probably not a lot of sales outside of the local area or even within their families, to an economy that is one that is based more on money and also the buying and selling of goods. Now, think about what we think of when we think of the word market. We think of a place where goods are both sold, right? In other words, produced and also sold. Okay? So every time you walk into a store, Target, Walmart, Harris Teeter, if it's a grocery store, whatever it is, guys, you are literally in some way, shape, or form walking into something that has a market associated with it. Now, for those of you that have ever gone to places like farmers markets, maybe that's a little bit more to people bring their goods there, people buy them. Therefore, that exchange is a little bit different. But at the end of the day, guys, it involves business in some type of transaction that involves probably the use of some kind of money. In other words, cash. Okay? 3 elements that basically define the market economy: manufacturing, free enterprise, and then also, as we talked about a little bit in our last session, the importance of both banking and bank notes. Yes, you're going to start to see, guys, or shall we say continue to see the rise of how this is going to affect people wanting loans, being able to go out and get loans to start a business, okay? Those of you that might have parents or people you know that have started their own businesses probably are going to have to do some degree of bank loans. Why? If you want to go out and start a business that costs, let's say, $250,000 to $500,000, I don't know of a whole lot of people that are just wealthy enough to already have that money in the bank to put down a down payment on that. What does it mean? You're going to have to convince a financial institution, probably a bank, that you're worthy of getting that loan. So let's start for it. So with manufacturing, guys, think about what probably comes to mind when you think of manufacturing. We think of what? Making things, producing things, okay? The idea of plants, factories, etc. All right? That's going to be important. The labor that we see in many of these factories is going to be something that's an ongoing thing. You almost always hear about the rise of things like factory labor. Some people call it even, guys, as expressions like the idea of wage slavery eventually develops. People that are literally working 14 to 16-hour days to actually support them and their families in a lot of these cities, particularly northern cities. And as you can see here, a lot of these cities and towns, like Lowell, Massachusetts, as we saw with our previous lesson, these are going to be developing some of the biggest textile booms in the United States are going to be taking place right smack dab around Boston, and in the case of Lowell, guys, a little bit north of there. What do we notice? Lowell is going to be connected to things like steam power, canals. So the idea of being able to bring different resources into these places, because you need cotton to basically produce textiles, and you need basically transportation to make it go from place to place. What do we notice? We notice that law becomes important. In fact, women that were mostly single, there was even a system that they developed called the Lowell system, where they would actually have almost like dormitories, guys, for these women to stay. And what would they do? You guessed it. They would house them until many of them married, of course, moved in with their families, husbands, had kids. And then, of course, many of them would actually transition to more domestic housewife roles. Okay. But keep in mind, what's going to happen is that we're noticing competition between businesses and companies for profits. What does the word profit means? It's money that you're making above their bottom line. So after you've paid for all your resources, paid your laborers, etc., what do you have left over? And therefore, what happens, that's kind of the basic nuts and bolts of free enterprise. So these companies, guys, as a consumer, as we'll see more in a second, a consumer should really make the free enterprise system work to their advantage. Why? Because if you have 5 or 10 stores in your general area that can sell the same goods, and you're a consumer and you have the opportunity to buy, consumers should have a lot of power to be able to say, okay, I'm going to go here. Why? Because the prices are cheaper. Maybe the customer service is better. The list goes on and on. Okay. What we do notice, guys, in the area of labor for many of these manufacturing places is that you notice the difference between skilled and unskilled. The question might be, what's the difference? What is it? Yeah. Unskilled would be something that would be a little bit easier to pick up. Maybe it doesn't involve as much, let's say apprenticeship, somebody that's going to work under somebody that's actually learning to be, let's say like a mason, or let's say somebody that does like brickwork, or I guess that would be about the same thing or similar. Okay, that would be skilled. Unskilled would be somebody that you can basically plug into a job because somebody quits quickly, and there's not going to be a lot of training to be able to put them in a position to actually do that kind of job. Okay. And so think about it. If you can do something on the job that takes you maybe an hour or two to learn, or maybe even a week, as opposed to weeks and months and even years of training, that is most likely going to be unskilled. There are exceptions to these rules though. Okay. And then what do we as Americans have to, or at least we're in a position to really do with this market revolution? We are going to be more dependent on consumerism, buying things, making economic decisions that involves money. Last time I checked, even if you're somebody like Jeff Bezos, who a couple years ago made $12 billion, according to the news, off of the stock market in a given day, money is still a scarce resource to most of us people. And you might say, well, Mr. Baker, he's going to be worth and is worth, probably $100 billion, give or take. Therefore, he's going to maybe have it a little bit easier with what he can buy as opposed to middle class people. That is going to be true in some ways. But those people like him, Bill Gates, et cetera, even the John D. Rockefellers in the later 1800s, early 1900s, they still have to make economic what? Choices. Okay. And then banking with loans to businesses. Okay. So think about it like this, guys. Where's most of this large scale manufacturing going to be developing? About 85% of it, according to estimates, is going to be developing in places like New England, parts of the area that we currently call the Midwest or Old Northwest back then. In other words, only about 15% of that is going to be large scale manufacturing in parts of the South. Why is that important? Well, let's take a look at a couple of things. So with Lowell and women, guys, maybe pause your screen for a moment. What comes to mind when you see this kind of image with the factories and manufacturing? Would it be a job that you would have been interested in doing? Are there any major dangers to this? And the answer is yes and yes. Okay, so if you take a look here, guys, you'll notice that many of these machines are obviously dangerous machines. You could easily lose limbs, arms, feet, etc. Guys, if you think about this, what do we notice in a way, but they don't really take shape until a little bit later? We notice even the early attempts at things like labor unions, which again, you might say, well, Mr. Baker, that's not really going to be effective until the later 1800s, 1900s, and beyond. While that is true, guys, you have to get a start somewhere. These unions and groups are going to be advocating for the best interests of laborers from the standpoint of work conditions, from the standpoint of things like wages and child labor. And guys, keep this in mind. For those of you that are teenagers watching this out there, children back then are not just working because they want to have the next best car or the next best Xbox or whatever. They are literally working as a means of family survival. Okay? So what's going to happen with this first industrial revolution, as we'll end, guys, today, with creating sectional tension? Well, first of all, remember, sectionalism is that division. It could be economic, it could be political, it could be social, it could be cultural. By the way, some of those things actually blend in together, but it is basically division based upon regions of the country and their feelings about how, in some cases, government is treating their sets of interests. Okay, so a lot of you guys might be like, well, Mr. Baker, last time we talked about the idea of a debate on internal improvements. Well, go back to what we looked at with that particular map, okay? And guys, it's very clear, as you can see, what are we seeing with this development of a lot of this internal improvements? We're seeing a lot more emphasis in northern states and also Midwestern or old Northwestern states. So, you might say, okay, well, Henry Clay was a big advocate of this American system that really emphasized internal improvements. He also believed, guys, that the federal government had a responsibility to develop a national economy. And if you think about it, guys, the word national really means, in this sense, that we have a commitment to the nation as a whole, not just one region, but the nation as a whole. Okay? And so as you can see, okay, we notice that this is going to create considerable problems. If you're somebody from, let's say, the state of South Carolina, you're not going to be as favorable of this. Why? Because you're not seeing the benefits toward a national economy that benefits your region. Okay? So whether or not somebody like John C. Calhoun, who was a big Southern, South Carolinian, or whether you're looking at somebody else, guys, the one thing that we notice is that people are looking at this from a different set of lenses and perspectives. Okay? So debates start to pop up. Factory system that's going to define the northern economy because of things like the rise of textiles in more detail, as opposed to the plantation system. Okay? So labor is going to play a big role with that. Okay? Free labor in the north, and unfortunately, the development of slave labor, or the further development of it, guys. Plantation systems were heavily defined on the basis of large-scale farming, usually something that would involve usually cash crops, especially cotton, keep in mind. Therefore, you're going to see a very large concentration there, which brings us to, again, another big thing, which is the cotton kingdom that defined the southern economy as opposed to the northern manufacturing. Okay? So pause your screen for a second and ask yourselves the question, okay, how does this industrial revolution further add to America's development, not just within our part of the world, but the world as a whole? Now, I don't know if I would go as far to say that we're a world power at this point in time, but we are a developing country that will, in fact, make that transition later this century, and certainly as we transition into the early 1900s. So what stands out? Okay, we're noticing the development of dairy. Okay, we're noticing the development, guys, of things along the lines of manufacturing, shipping. Okay, Port cities that have obviously developed: Boston, Providence, New York City, Philadelphia. Okay, you don't see as many of those cities. Therefore, urbanization, which is the growth of cities, is going to take place much more quickly in the northern states. You can see that also with Cincinnati there, as it will with states that are in the south: Charleston, Richmond, Virginia, okay, Mobile, Alabama. And then as you can see there, also New Orleans, okay? And so think about it, guys. What do we notice in the South, and also some parts of the area that we also associate to an extent with the Old Northwest? We're seeing a lot of cotton, okay? And think about it like this, guys. If you have a lot of cotton, you can sell it abroad, but you can also sell it within the country to all these northern factories to actually make it clear that, you know what, this is a good, lucrative resource. It brought a lot of wealth to people in southern states. Unfortunately, a lot of people are also going to defend the institution of slavery as the peculiar institution. John C. Calhoun referred to it later on in the 1830s as a positive good. And of course, you're also going to have a lot of people in the North that condemn it. Okay? So the question you might have is, how has the manufacturing changed over time? Just a quick little thing for those of you that have actually noticed this. You hear all the time in the news about debates about bringing industry back to the United States from abroad. A lot of you guys, if you've ever heard the term things outside the country, all right, outsourcing jobs, etc., outsourcing production. We're seeing, guys, that within the United States, we see obviously how this affects us with changes from even the previous things. And this is a relatively recent, example going back to about 4 years ago. Okay. I want to encourage you guys to connect the Industrial Revolution to things that affect the people's social status, politics of the era, with people disagreeing over taxes and paying for these things, etc. Things that we'll continue to build upon in the future lessons. Just a couple of reminders for my students for week 4. Make sure that in standard that you have submitted the Industrial Revolution activity from day 1. That's only standard, keep in mind. Okay. Make sure that you've completed the week 4 review activity for standard. Guys, remember, you can take that as many times as you want. It reviews vocab. It also reviews things along the lines of questions that you could likely see on your mastery quiz. Okay. And as you'll see, guys, everybody honors and standard is going to be wanting to master that quiz Friday morning. Okay. I have a suggestion for the standard students. If you do not master it on the first try, my suggestion to you, go back to your weekly review activity, work with that material a little bit more, go over the questions that you missed, come to office hours between 9, 10, 10, or 11. Okay. We're not going to have a video session that this week. We're not going to have a skills session. So therefore, that can be completely, what things do you need me to review? And the support is there. For honors, there will be support between 9, 10, 10, and 11 with the essay assignment that you're working on. Please follow the directions, submit it as a Word or PDF form. If you are taking extra time to do that, that is more than acceptable, but it does need to be submitted no later than 2:30 p.m. on that Friday to be considered on time. Okay. As always, this is Mr. Baker, Baker's Corner, Baker's Backyard. Feel free to reach out if you need anything at bakerd@franklineconomy.org. Otherwise, take care, be safe, and guys, hope you're learning some cool stuff. Next week, we transition to social history. Bye-bye.